All right, so the last thing that we covered in our last lecture, last discussion, was mention of this book, How the Other Half Lives, written by Jacob Riis in 1890. So we're going to I want to show a video that tells a little bit about the story of Jacob Riis and the book that he wrote. And there are a couple connections to what we've been talking about and what we're going to talk about in today's lecture. So before you watch today's lecture, I want you to watch the video that I posted, the Jacob Riis video that I posted in Schoology. And you'll see, I'll give you a little context. The story is about the living conditions of the poor working class people living in New York City at the turn of the century. He writes the book in 1890. And Jacob Riis is living in New York City, and this is a time period after what some call the Second Industrial Revolution, where cities were growing and life was changing. There were all new technologies and new businesses and industries, and the cities were growing like crazy. So he tells the story of what the conditions were like for the people living in these cities. And it's a connection not only to this sociological perspective of things and trying to understand society and make society better, but it also will be connected, and that's what we talked about in our last lecture, this different perspective, this sociological perspective. And then you're also going to see that it's directly connected to something that we're going to hit in today's lecture after the video. So I want you to pause this, go ahead and watch that video that's posted, and then when you come back, we'll pick up on today's lecture. Okay, so there are a couple more things I want to cover in this first unit. And today I want to focus kind of primarily on the roots of and the history of where sociology came from. The first lecture we did, the first bit of the notes, is all about just understanding the big idea of what sociology is, what we're trying to do with sociology. Today I want to talk a little bit about where that came from. And the first thing I want to throw at you is just this idea of the science of sociology. The people that we're going to meet today in this little lecture would be very upset with me if I didn't stress the science of sociology. The problem is when you start to apply the tools and the methodologies, and we're going to see the scientific method to studying human behavior and society, that becomes very difficult. Why is it so difficult to study humans and the way they behave scientifically, as opposed to, say, studying cells or studying chemicals or something like that? Think about that for a second. And ultimately, if you think about that, what I want you to recognize is how different a human being is compared to a cell and or two chemicals mixing together. Humans are far more complex, and the answers aren't quite as black and white and straightforward. But the reality of the situation is, and this is what sociology teaches us, is that understanding humans as they behave in society might be a little bit more black and white than we actually think. And that's where sociology comes in, to use scientific methods to try to answer questions and make sense of it. So speaking of the scientific method, here's a quick little review. This is stuff you've learned since second grade in science. You started learning the scientific method, and if you're in an advanced placement science class at this point, the scientific method has grown and become more complex. And here's just a quick little overview of some of the main pieces that sociologists are going to use when they're studying society, the same way that a biologist or a chemist would use them to study biology and chemistry. If you remember, you want to define your problem. You want to create your research question, so to speak. What is it that we're trying to answer or figure out? Sociologist, as any good scientist, wants to review the literature. Whatever research has been done in the past, anything has been written about this particular topic, this problem, this issue. Then a good scientist, in this case a good sociologist, is going to formulate a hypothesis. You remember that a hypothesis is an educated guess. What do we think the result's going to be when we test this thing? And that's when you do the test. Step 4 is to actually conduct your research, do your experiment, collect all your data, observe your subjects and all that kind of stuff so that you can get to number 5. You analyze all those results, all that data, and you may come to some conclusion. You may propose a theory. You may answer your question. You may not. But just as a chemist or a biologist does this, so do sociologists when they apply it to answering questions about society. One thing that is still evident and true, and it's a big part of being a biologist or chemist, but it's even bigger when you start talking about sociologists and psychologists dealing with human beings, is the question of ethics. A good sociologist is always concerned with the ethical issues surrounding anything that they're studying. What are ethics? Well, you've already defined this at least once doing your homework. So here's a definition again in your notes. Ethics are principles of conduct concerning what is good, moral, and right. Basically, sociologists have ethical standards. They cannot do things that are going to hurt humans in their studies. They're not going to lie to humans, deceive humans. They're not going to do things that could cause them harm or put them in danger. We don't want to violate people's privacy. We don't want to violate people's personal things. So there's always the ethical side of any good sociological research that you do. Keep that in mind if you become a sociologist. All right, so that's just a little reminder that this certainly is a science. Okay, the other thing that I wanted to hit on today was, all right, so where did all this come from? How did this start? And so I want to touch a little bit on the roots. Now, we're not going to spend too much time on this. We have other more significant things we want to get to throughout this 9 weeks, but I at least want to give you some background. So there's two things that I want to point out that are historical events, essentially, that have a lot to do with the beginning of sociology. And that first is something we call the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a period primarily in Europe, but eventually it spread through to other places in the 16 and 1700s when things started to change about the way we viewed the world, about the way things operated, and I'll get to that in a second. But the Enlightenment was even sort of rooted in the age of exploration. You remember learning about the explorers, exploring, branching out from Europe and exploring South America and Africa and places in Asia and all that kind of stuff. Well, when that happened, human beings started to become globally connected. We started to learn that there were other cultures out there. We started to learn that new technologies, new ideas, new ways of thinking, and when those things got shared back and forth through like the Columbian Exchange and trading and all that kind of stuff, it brought on all kinds of new ways of looking at the world. You kind of mix that into the Enlightenment period in the 16 and 1700s, and all of a sudden we see revolutions starting to happen, political revolutions, societal revolutions. Two big ones that were really a kind of hallmarks of this changing the way people thought and viewed the world were the French Revolution and what other big one? That's right, the revolution that happened here in the United States. And when these things started to happen, like hundreds-year-old ways that things always operated were being turned upside down. And all of a sudden, you're telling me that France doesn't have to be ruled by a king or a queen and passed down through bloodlines for generation upon generation of leadership? That's not how it has to work? Oh, you're telling me that in Great Britain, the colonies don't have to be ruled by the king the way things have, and they can rule them, and all of a sudden we get to see all these different ways to view the world. Those changes that were happening really created a situation for people to start looking at questions about society, about human beings, about how we live, and start applying some of these scientific methodologies to understand it and make sense of it. Now, that's not the only thing. We had in this historic event as well, and between the Enlightenment and now the Industrial Revolution, we really have the historic events that psychology or sociology is rooted in. When the Industrial Revolution occurred, sociologists started to look at the dramatic changes that were happening in human life. The way that we lived on a daily basis was changing like crazy with new technologies, new ideas, new industries, new businesses, new ways to work, new ways to live. For example, the growth of cities I have here. When cities started to grow and change in the late 1800s in particular, the way of life was quite a bit different. And we had started to see things that never existed in human history. And so we started to want to make sense of that. How does all this affect the way we live our lives? And so sociological ideas were starting to be applied to that. Book mentions some of the heavy hitters, and we're going to spend less time than we did on those two historical events here with the sociologist. But I do want to go over at least a couple of the names that you want to associate with the beginnings of sociology and give you a little tidbit about each one. So your book mentions all 5 of these. Actually, I have 6 here if you add in Harriet Martineau. So when I did my research and I started looking at other sociology books and different curriculums and trying to decide, how much of this history stuff do I even want to go over at the beginning, these names continuously came up, and I said, you know what, I should at least make them familiar with them. Again, I'm not going to hold you responsible for knowing everything about these people, and to be honest, there's not a whole lot I know about them either. I haven't studied them in great detail myself. But the first one here on the list, Auguste Comte, he is considered to be the father of sociology. He was fascinated by the French Revolution, as we mentioned on the last slide. He studied and was fascinated by this chaos that came with revolution and overturning traditional thoughts and ideas and changing them into a whole different way to live. And he studied all that and was fascinated by it. And he started to apply some of these scientific methodologies to try to make sense of how these changes were defining who we were as human beings. So he's the first to really do that. Then you get into Emile Durkheim. We're going to learn a little bit more at the end of this lecture about functionalism, his perspective. Ultimately, he was fascinated by looking at all of the different institutions that make up society. We have all these different groups and all these systems in place, and he recognized that in order for us to live happy lives, it is important for things to be in order, for these institutions to operate the way that they're supposed to, and when they're all operating appropriately together, society can run smoothly. He was also fascinated by the overthrow of kings and revolutions and how that smooth operating society can be turned upside down, and he wanted to make sense of those kinds of things. The book talks about Herbert Spencer. Herbert Spencer was more interested in one of the other events that we talked about, the Industrial Revolution. He was fascinated by the economics of it, the competition. He was fascinated by, there were owners and then workers and there were managers and how all those things fit into place. In fact, he coined the concept, or the term, and he kind of pioneered the idea of what he called social Darwinism. Charles Darwin was a scientist that theorized about evolution and about survival of the fittest out there in the natural world. Well, Herbert Spencer thought those basic principles of survival of the fittest can also be applied to human beings and society. The strongest will rise to the top, the weakest will fall to the bottom or be weeded out, and that's how society will carry on. Karl Marx, this is probably a familiar picture and a familiar name. You've learned about Karl Marx in other classes and in other social studies classes, if you ever studied economics in particular, but he was also an early sociologist. He was fascinated by politics, by religion, by social institutions, by the economics of how societies operate. Basically, he was pretty much rooted most of his understandings, or at least he thought we could figure out and understand society if we look at the struggles between different groups. The haves and the have-nots, for example, the people at the top and the people at the bottom, and why is that the case, and we can understand society by analyzing those kinds of things. Last guy that your book talks about, because they do give some shout outs to some of the women that were involved in the roots of this discipline, but Max Weber, another early sociologist, he was interested in more into the specific individual interactions of human beings within the group. So he wanted to learn and understand and apply scientific research to understanding what meaning do we place in the different behaviors and actions that we do. For example, and I think the book uses this example, we stick out a hand and we give a handshake. Well, there's a lot of symbolic meaning to that, and it can mean different things at different times. It can mean different things between different people. It can even mean different things in different cultures. And he felt like understanding the symbolic meanings behind our actions could help us figure out society and how it worked. Again, still applying scientific methods to try to make sense of that. And then finally, I'm flying through these. Your book does give a shout out to at least one woman, and there might be a couple mentioned there, but Harriet Martineau, she was a contemporary of these other early sociologists. Interesting thing about her is that, from what I understand, she kind of takes this idea of studying and understanding society using the scientific methods to another step, because she believed that the reason we want to study it and understand it is so that we can figure out solutions to problems in society. So she was more, action-oriented, more solution-oriented. But unfortunately, in the era that this was all rooted in, and where it's kind of derived from, was a male-driven culture, and so the women don't find their place in the roots of sociology so much as they would today in modern sociology. So there's a wee little bit about the major heavy hitters. I just want you to write their names down and have an idea of, just be able to identify them really more than anything. Okay. So we did a little bit about the science of it. Here we have some people and some events historically where it's rooted. And I want to wrap this lecture up with kind of taking all this and ending back where we started, just with this big picture idea of the sociological perspective. I think we have a pretty good handle on what we mean when we say that now. I hope you do. And now I'm going to kind of add a little bit to it with a couple other perspectives, or a couple other ways to break that sociological perspective down. The three perspectives here are the functionalist perspective, the conflict perspective, and the interactionist perspective. I'm just going to give a quick overview of each of them. The sociologists who fall into the functionalist perspective, they look at society almost like a human body. They believe that the whole society is made up of all these different systems that are all doing their own things, but they're all connected. And in order for the body to work, your blood system has to be working, your nervous system, your heart has to pump, all your organs have to work. Your digestive system, everything has to be working, doing its own thing, but all working together to make it work. And they look at society that same way. All the institutions have to work together for things to run smoothly. Another way to look at trying to understand society is through the conflict perspective. This is basically understanding society based on conflict. Power struggles between groups of people, power struggles between haves and have-nots, power struggles between different institutions. A lot of it has to do with conflict and conflict resolution. Conflict doesn't always mean violence, although sometimes it is that, but even peaceful conflicts that we sit down and negotiate peaceful solutions to. These sociologists that are from this conflict perspective are fascinated by that. And then finally, there's the interactionist perspective. This sometimes is called the symbolic interactionist perspective, because these sociologists look at all of the interaction between human beings and all the meaning in that interaction. And they put a lot into understanding the symbols that we utilize. We have all kinds of symbols. In fact, I used the example earlier of a handshake. That's symbolic of a lot of different things. But we have physical symbols like logos for sports teams. We have symbols like a mascot at our football game, the lancer running down the sideline, and that symbolizes our school and our team, and symbolizes our pride and all that kind of stuff. So the interactionist perspective is figuring out and understanding society based on all of the interactions between human beings and what those things mean. All right, that's a whirlwind of the science, the roots, and this final theoretical perspectives. I'm going to end with this. One more quick write. Get out your journal, and I want you to just quickly, from memory, try it. But if you can't, go back into your notes that you just wrote down and see if you can write down one or two things that you remember about those three theoretical perspectives. If you have questions, hit me up. Have a great day.